Hello, I'm Tiffany from Stitch and Addiction. I design and create high-quality historical fashion for literary characters. And today, in this video, A Dress for Jane Bennet, I'm going to be showing you the process of how I go from a piece of literature and choosing a character, characterizing that character, doing the research about the era and the context, and designing a dress, and then ultimately creating that dress from drafting the pattern to sewing and then modeling it as well. This video is a CosTube Symposium or Cozy 2021 video brought to you by CosTube. I highly recommend that you check out the program, which I've linked in my description box below, and some videos and events by other CosTube makers. You can also follow the hashtag Cozy2021 as we will be hashtagging our YouTube videos and posts on Instagram with that hashtag. Before I start explaining the process, I do want to give a disclaimer. I am coming at this process from the perspective of an English major, an English teacher, and a seamstress of 30 years. I am not a theater major, a dress design major, or a historian. So I am mostly looking at it through the lens of literature and sewing and doing the research from there to make them as historically accurate as possible. The first step in creating historical clothing for your literary cosplay is to characterize your chosen character. I don't consider choosing a character a step because we all have our favorite literary works and our favorite characters in those works, and so I'm sure that if you are watching this video today, you already have a favorite literary character in mind. One of the things that I find helpful in this process is to reread the book. I do that one of two ways. I either listen to an audio version while I'm sewing something else, or I will actually get a paper copy of the book and reread it with sticky notes in hand, and as I'm reading it, I will make notes about character traits that I notice and the evidence that supports the character traits in the book. You can also just sit down and brainstorm if it's a work that you've read very often. You can sit down and brainstorm a list of character traits that you think of when you think of that character, and then you can go to something like the Gutenberg project and pull up a copy of that work and use the find feature on your browser to find that character's name or other keywords that will help you confirm those character traits with evidence. I like to come up with 2 to 4 major character traits when I'm doing this process. Once I've decided these character traits, it will help me decide things like dress design details and colors for their outfit or their ensemble. And so it's very important to get their character traits firmly in my mind before I'm going into further details on the outfit, the dress, or the ensemble. So Jane Bennet from Pride and Prejudice will be our example today. And I think of 2 major character traits when I think of Jane. The first one is compliant. Her dad actually says this about her toward the very end of the book after she's gotten engaged to Bingley. But we also see this in many other ways. Unlike Lizzie, she is very compliant with the societal expectations for women. So she is very obedient to her mother's wishes when her mother is trying to play matchmaker, and it doesn't seem like Jane ever really fights against those expectations. She has some conversations with Lizzie where you can tell that Jane definitely does want to marry for true love as well. But she is not saying or doing the things that Lizzie is doing to defy her mother in her mother's matchmaking attempts. Jane is also very generous, both with her kindness and her forgiveness. We see this with members of her family, such as forgiving her mother in different situations, but we also see her kind-heartedness when her and Elizabeth are having discussions about various other characters in the novel. For example, when Elizabeth relays the story about Wickham and Georgiana, Jane is still trying to find something possibly good about Wickham or some possible explanation for why he might have done such a thing. Now that we have characterized Jane as both compliant and generous, we are going to move on to the next step of this process, to research the historical context of the novel and the setting. There's a couple things to consider when researching this. You want to consider what country is this set in. Of course, you want to consider what time period is this set in. You want to consider the social status of your character. And then, of course, you want to research the fashion of all three of those things. What was the fashion for that country, for that era, and for someone of that social status? There are many resources that I use to research this part. And of course, the sources that I use to research depend on the things that I just mentioned: the country, the time period, and even the social status. The resources I'm going to mention today are mostly geared toward the Regency era, which was the era that Pride and Prejudice is set in. But if you are interested in resources for the mid-Victorian period, which is the other period that I mostly focus on, feel free to comment below and ask me, and I will definitely link those for you as well. All of these resources that I'm about to go over are linked in the description box below, and I highly recommend checking them out. The first one that's invaluable is Dress in the Age of Jane Austen. This book does an outstanding job of helping you understand the social implications of dress during Jane Austen's period, specifically, of course, in the United Kingdom, and of course, in the time period that Pride and Prejudice was set in. Another book that I have found very helpful is Regency Women's Dress by Cassidy Percoco. This actually has patterns drawn in it on graph paper that you can size up. They are drawn from extant garments, and then it also has some descriptions to help you understand how they're put together. This has been very helpful when I've been trying to figure out Spencers, which you will see one later in this video, for the Regency era. One of the other resources that actually works for multiple time periods and is not just a book. I actually have the book, The 19th Century Fashion in Detail, but it has the V&A on it. It's pieces from the Victoria and Albert Museum, which you can actually access a lot of these online. So if you don't want to invest in the book, you can definitely Google Victoria and Albert Museum and look at the extant garments and photos that are out there. This shows some things up close and explains some things, and it's all through the 19th century, so you kind of have to page through it to find the pieces that apply to the Regency era, but this is a great resource for seeing things up close and in detail. And then finally, this one actually applies to the mid-Victorian as well, Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion #1. I have the old version, but the School of Historical Dress is in the process of currently reprinting this in an updated version, and so I definitely recommend getting this. This is also similar to the other book I showed you. It has the patterns drawn out on graph paper with descriptions of the construction and all of those things. You can find the links for all of those resources in the description box below. A final resource that I have utilized a lot is the Met's online database. So if you Google the Met Museum, you can access photos of extant garments that they have there as well. They have garments from all over the world, not just from the United States, and so you can narrow it down by the specific country that you're looking for, by the specific time period, and all of those things. And those photos are also invaluable. They're very high quality, and they allow you to zoom in very closely in order to be able to see the details. And then once you've completed your research, I highly recommend that you curate some sort of inspiration board, either physical or digital. I know people that use things like binders and even a actual physical inspiration board, but I prefer to use Pinterest. I have linked the inspiration board for Jane Bennet's dress in the description box below, so you can kind of get an example of what I do, but definitely put all of those things, or as many as possible of them, in one place so that you have that resource to refer to as you move throughout this process. Because sometimes I'll be like, oh, I want to do this on this dress or this jacket or whatever, and then I'll be like, wait, where did I get that idea from? Was that really true to the time period or the country And so if I have already put it on that inspiration board, it's easy for me to go back and trace where I got that from. So using Jane as an example for the researching the historical context, we know, of course, that she would have been in the United Kingdom. We know that her social status was that she was from the landed gentry class, and so she would have been a gentleman's daughter. She, however, would have been a country gentleman's daughter, so her clothes would have been a little bit more practical, not quite as ornate or even quite as up-to-date as people from like London. But she still would have had things that were definitely in fashion for that specific year. Because Pride and Prejudice was actually started by Austen in the late 1790s, but not actually published until 1811, I tend to focus on the years 1800 to 1810 when I am designing clothing for the characters from Pride and Prejudice. So the dress that I'm going to end up designing for Jane today is more like the very early 1800s, or 1800 to about 1805, which still squarely fits within that window of time that I typically focus on for Pride and Prejudice. Step 3 in this process is to determine what color your character may have worn and, of course, the type of fabric that they would have worn. The type of fabric, of course, goes back to the historical context that you just finished researching. So research what types of fabrics were worn, what types of fibers, what types of prints. In the case of Jane Bennet, the fibers that were used during the Regency era were all natural fibers. They would have been linen, cotton, silk, and wool. Cotton would have been the cheapest and most predominant fiber of the Regency period because of the forced labor in the southern United States. So I have chosen cotton for her dress and then a linen for her spencer. You also need to consider colors. I just usually go to Google and I Google the symbolism of different colors, and then I kind of try to match those symbolisms with the character traits that I've already kind of fixed in my mind for that character. So in the case of Jane Bennet, we characterized her as compliant and generous. So I started with the color blue. For some reason, I was thinking that color might tie in well with her characterization. And it actually turned out to be pretty spot on. When I researched blue, I discovered that it symbolized things like trust, sincerity, loyalty, calmness, tranquility, non-confrontational, supportiveness, all of those things. We see many of those character traits in Jane. She was very loyal and compliant, as we've already talked about. She was very supportive of Lizzie. She was non-confrontational, which goes along with her compliance. So many of those tie into that. I went a little further and looked at light blue, and light blue goes even further and deeper. It symbolizes things like understanding, once again, tranquility, and also softness, which ties into that pliability as well. And of course, the understanding ties into her generosity and her kindness and forgiveness. So I actually ended up going with the color light blue. The other color that I went with for Jane is a very light ivory color, almost like a winter white, because white symbolizes innocence. And we know that Jane gives off like an air of innocence because of her generous heart, and she always thinks the best of people. She appears very innocent, as in she hasn't been spoiled by bitterness against people in the world. Step 4 is where you actually get to begin physically creating the ensemble or the dress. I like to begin by sketching out the dress or the ensemble. I typically do not exactly replicate an extant, but instead I'll take the majority of my inspiration from one extant and then maybe add some details from other extants into the design that I'm creating. So in order to get that picture fully in my mind, I'll sketch it out so that I have everything all together in one place. And I can also make sure that what I'm picturing in my mind is actually going to look good together once I sketch it out. When you design, you want to incorporate details that connect with the characterization of that character. For example, I included bows and ruffles in Jane's ensemble because she was very compliant with the societal expectations for women in her day, and so I feel like her clothing would have been fairly feminine, and ruffles and bows seem to speak to that. Although the dress that I ended up designing and creating is inspired by several fashion plates from the era, I largely patterned it based on this half robe that is in Janet Arnold's Patterns of Fashion #1. So I used the idea of the crossover bodice and the button loops to create the ruching, and even the way the sleeves are mostly done in order to actually pattern the dress. I just lengthen the skirts so that they're a full length instead of a half length. And here you can see the sketch that I came up with for the dress. You can see the bow that ties in the front, the little tucks on the sleeves, of course the crossover bodice, the ruffles at the bottom. I ended up only going with one, but the original design had a couple, as well as the spencer. The spencer was also inspired by several fashion plates and photos from the era, and I combined a couple of different ones in order to create the spencer with the bows in the front and the bow in the back. And then finally over here you can see the light blue cotton batiste and the ivory or winter white linen that I chose. The winter white linen was used for the spencer and the light blue batiste was used for the dress. Once you have the sketch done, then of course you want to pattern it. However you do that, whether you use a pattern that you have bought from someone, you pattern hack, or you draft it, which is what I do. And then of course you're going to sew the entire thing together. I'm going to let you see just a little bit into my process on all of those things next. I would say that step 5 is optional, but I really don't want you to think of it as optional because for me, it's one of the most fun steps in this entire process and probably the reason that you began this entire process to begin with. Step 5 is to reenact scenes from the book wearing your ensemble that you have created. In this case, this dress is created specifically for the scene when Jane goes to visit Netherfield. She goes to visit Caroline Bingley at Netherfield. And so I created a dress that was a day dress. And then of course I had to create a spencer to go with it because of course she would have been outside when she was going to visit Caroline and the Bingleys. Sometimes you will not be able to exactly reenact things, as you'll see in my next clip. There are no houses built in the early 1800s in my area, and my area of the United States does not look anything like the United Kingdom. However, my sister served as my model for this Jane Bennet ensemble, and we had fun trying to replicate a scene as closely as we could of Jane visiting Netherfield. have found this video helpful today in your sewing journey as you create historical clothing for your favorite literary character. I would love to know what literary character you are going to create historical clothing for in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed today's video, definitely check out my Facebook, Instagram, and subscribe to me here on YouTube for more similar content. To get your cozy badge for watching this video, use the link in the description box. It will have a Google form for you to fill out, and then they will send you your badge to add to your collection. Don't forget to check out the CosTube Symposium program and find some other events and videos to participate in. If you've enjoyed today's video, please like, share, and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.